Chair, thank you for that very clear and structured presentation, your 7-point guide to understanding complexity and vulnerability. That was very good. We have now 25 minutes for questions and discussion. So I would invite you all now to put up your hands if you have a point to make, a question to ask, anything to say at all. And I'll take 3 or 4 or 5 people's questions, and then we can share them out for a response in the panel. And Liam, we have our online participants as well. So if you can hear me, online participants, you're very welcome to email in your questions, points, anything you want to say to Liam, and then we can come to you later. So, lots. Okay, we'll start with this lady here, please.
My name is Parna. My name is Parna. My background is architecture and urban design. I was project director for reconstruction of BAM in Iran. From 32,000, it was not larger scale compared to 100,000, but actually I was project director for 2,100 homes through people-centered reconstruction it was, and government had control over funding people. From the beginning, designers and engineers, we were involved. Through that process, I saw how, what Joe said, that program, that complex program, that diverse stakeholders, they are important in how much successful that reconstruction would be. And that framework, how are the links between different stakeholders? Sometimes you think it's very small link of that chain, but the effect is very big. And the way, and then actually I think that for a strategic approach to complex recovery program, the construction in professional sector needs to receive help from strategic management principles, because that diverse stakeholders, they create organizational structure, and this organizational structure needs organizational approach, which actually management more deals with that. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Come to Shailesh next, and there's a lady there, okay.
Thanks for great presentations, all of you, by the way. One issue that I want to probe on about scaling up, specifically with regards to this book and also Joe's book, and I would say also the World Bank's Reconstruction Handbook, is this issue of emphasizing policy and planning framework which requires government participation or input or leadership. Is scaled up people-centered reconstruction possible without that effectively? That's one question. And the other one is slightly different in that all the learning, I think somebody mentioned that, yes, we don't need to preach to the converted. Everyone here, by and large, has heard this similar messages before. But at the same time, if you actually look at practical projects on the ground in Haiti now or other places, how much of this learning is actually being translated into action? And again, I mean, especially, for example, looking at Turkey, the examples of using reconstruction as means of not regenerating NGOs, sorry, for Haiti, that wouldn't be too good. They've already got far too many. But I meant more community-based organizations or groups, community activism, or generating that type of activism. I wonder if that is actually happening, or even local government development. Again, from what you mentioned, that had happened as well to a degree.
So, sorry, I neglected to say this. Can you say who you are, and if you're working or whatever?
Sailesh Katari. I work with RICS Disaster Management Commission.
Great. And could you pass the microphone to the lady in the third row? Just introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Zara. I'm with King's College, and I'm working on disaster risk reduction in various parts of the world. Great. I can't wait to read this book. Thanks. I'm excited by it. But my question is, how do you navigate around issues of local power elites and politics on the ground. For example, in Pakistan, when you're covering such a huge area, such as the flooding situation, you have a huge variety of issues you're going to be dealing with, such as ethnic tensions, provincial tensions, just all kinds of hosts of issues. So, as with any participatory approach, how do you negotiate with issues such as that?
Good question, thank you. Some other gentleman just in front of you, just say who you are, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Mical, from Swansea University, postgraduate student, social development and conflicts. I've got a question which is to do with the solution to address urban construction when you're dealing with squatters and tenants. How do you deal with that solution, and if you're addressing that problem?
Another good question. I'll take, sorry, one more. I don't know who to take. I think I saw you first. Thank you. Please do.
Hello, my name's Felix Holman. I'm from a small NGO called Street Invest, and my particular interest is around kind of disenfranchised communities, the homeless. I wanted to refer back to your issue around legacy of kind of institutional learning, you know, what would happen next. And I want to know, did you have any examples where the sort of you're working with local municipalities and ministries in terms of planning laws and the sort of intricate bureaucracies had made a kind of, had left a legacy for the future that was kind of pro-poor and embraced kind of issues around squatters and homeless? And so that in slum communities, for example, those who'd lost homes that were informal, was there some allowance going forward that if anything was to happen again, their rights would be upheld?
Liam, can we take anything from our online friends or not? Okay. In that case, ladies and gentlemen, please, who would like to respond to any of those questions? Do you want to go first?
Okay. Okay, big list of questions. I'd like to respond on just one or 2 points, which kind of, I think, respond to the questions collectively, but I'm happy to be taken up on any of it. First of all, I think it is absolutely imperative if you want to do anything on any scale, and it doesn't matter if it's participatory development or anything else, to have an institutional framework and a political framework which accepts it. Without that, you are going to remain in the fragmented situation that Turkish activists have found themselves in. Not necessarily a bad thing, not necessarily unconstructive, but will never be scaled up until there's a permissive framework. Then there's a question of how you navigate within a framework like that. I think that it's very, very typical of foreign NGOs to try to, first of all, completely avoid any contact. It's too complicated, it's too different, it's in the wrong language. And they come, and very often, I'm afraid to say, they come there knowing all the answers already. And anything else is just going to confuse the picture and be unwelcome. So, in my experience, it takes a year or two until even local NGOs become audible to foreign NGOs, and a bit longer with authorities who are seen basically as counter-developmental in their approach and probably slightly pariah, and so on with ministers. I think that this is something that NGOs need to challenge themselves on. And it's very important, just as it's terribly important, somebody was saying the other day, why don't NGOs go to a new country with a translator? Why don't they hire somebody who will help them communicate? And I think this lack of communication is part of the problem. So I don't have any easy answers. My answer is you have to negotiate with local people if you want to get a locally appropriate and sustainable solution. The final point I'd like to raise is this issue of long-term attitudes towards people who are off the social scale. I think that's a very, very hard nut to crack. And I haven't seen it happen anywhere personally, What I do think happens is that people who are off the scale before the disaster and nobody wants to deal with them, if an agency like UN Habitat says, we're going to buy land and settle these people, then they become less of a pariah because they've ceased being Romani and they've started being ordinary citizens. But, or they've ceased being squatters, is what I really mean. So I think there's a long way to go on that. Thank you. That's all for now.
Who else would like to come in here? Joe?
I'd like to respond to particularly the first 2 points. It's music to my ears to hear someone other than me stressing the need for program management skills in terms of complex program management. It's an area that the group that I lead focuses on, and we define complex programs as with multiple stakeholders who from different cultures, quite often across multiple geographies, or programs which have got kind of multiple mini projects within them. The interesting thing is if you look at the most successful programs in terms of slum upgrading, they also involve complex stakeholders, where you are bringing together national government policy, local governments, with community groups. And this kind of stakeholder mapping is fantastically important. And there is a whole discipline of program management which is about as extremely different from construction management as you can get. Construction management is a linear process, and it's all about time, and Microsoft projects is a fantastic tool to use. Complex program management is a completely different discipline, which unfortunately there are a very limited number of people who have the kind of mindset to do, but it is an important point. The point about I don't believe that people-centered reconstruction at scale is possible unless you have a policy and planning framework that creates that permissive space. I think really the tragedy is that you ask yourself, well, why doesn't that happen? And that I think is a kind of key point. Who's responsible for developing that policy? And the answer is generally the government, if there is a government, or probably a UN organisation if there's not. I am working on a panel reviewing a whole lot of humanitarian response, and we were provided with a report last week, which was an analysis of numerous evaluation reports over the last 10 years, and it was extracting key themes. And one of perhaps the most depressing things that it extracted was that these reports consistently said that the people leading the process in country had no previous experience of humanitarian response. And particularly this is the UN, who are typically advising the government. And they may be UN developmental agencies, but the person who is the country coordinator, who has the closest ear to the government, does not necessarily have previous experience of humanitarian response. My own experiences in Sri Lanka, where I was working as a consultant for UNHCR, and I was therefore in these multi-donor meetings, where there were donors who have also got big influence because they're controlling the finances, are not people with experience of reconstruction. Reconstruction is probably one of the biggest expenditures, but actually the people sitting around the table talking about it are not people who understand this subject area. And I think that somehow things have got to change, so that people who really understand the complexities of this actually are there influencing and advising those who are in the position of decision making, because I think that's where the shortfall comes. At a sort of government level, I was in Sri Lanka and I lobbied very hard to get the government to involve the NHDA, who had built hundreds and hundreds of thousands of houses in Sri Lanka, and there was a whole political agenda, which is why that they were excluded. So I would like to completely reinforce Teo's point that the starting point is what happened before, who built houses in the country before. The issue with squatters and renters, particularly in urban environments, is fantastically challenging. It is a debate that is raging at the moment in terms of Haiti. I think a lot of the dialogue in Haiti has gone into freeze frame because people don't know what to do in an urban environment. There are buildings that were owned by somebody who no one can track down. They were lived in by multiple households, some of who are still around and some of who aren't. even actually getting permission to demolish a building, which is dangerous, is proving challenging. And I think, one of the things that causes the dialogue to stall is that people don't quantify the issue or the problem. It remains a general discussion about renters or squatters or multiple household, multiple story dwellings. And actually, if people really started trying to quantify that in terms of what houses, how many people, and actually did the damage and the needs assessments, to understand the problem on a sort of ward level basis, rather than thinking about Port-au-Prince as a totality, we would get a lot further, a lot quicker. The urban environments, if we're talking about clusters, you can do people-centred participatory housing with clusters of about 20 households. In an urban environment, you might say that at a ward level, you can manage to increase that to about 100 households. But we're trying to solve problems for whole urban settlements in one go, and I think we need to break it down and look at the problems on an individual basis. Who is there? Are they homeowners? Are they renters? Are they squatters? Do they own the land? What's their means? And actually, look at it in a way that we can create tailored solutions.
Thank you. Sorry, you just had one thing to add to this?
That's okay.
Are you sure?
I would like
Please.
to build on what Jill was saying. I do agree that for large-scale reconstruction to happen, you need some sort of framework at the top. What worries me, though, is apart from the fact that a lot of people get involved in setting that framework, don't know much about reconstruction, which you mentioned, is also that very often the affected people haven't got much of a voice in the process either. So you see sometimes frameworks being set where people are sort of with a big emphasis on relocation, and perhaps what some people are really thinking is we want to make this a more beautiful city, and we can use the argument that it's actually a pretty dangerous place to get these people out of that and deal with those slums. Yeah? Or we can use the coastal area, as people were saying in Sri Lanka, for tourism development. And well, let's forget about those fishermen living there. They need to go to a safer place. So unless we actually, for me, being people-centered is also to be able to hear the voices of the people at that level, so that those concerns can be brought up. Secondly, the issue of squatters and tenants, which I agree with Joe is a problem even when no disaster strike. I mean, it's very difficult to deal with the amount of slums we have, to upgrade them, and you only have to look at the Millennium Development Goals, where the sort of the least impressive goals is set at when we talk about slums, because there's 1 billion people living in slums, and the goal says let's make the lives of 100 million of them, 10% of them better. By the time we've achieved that, the increase in slum population will have outnumbered that vastly. It's not an ambitious target compared to targets for water, for sanitation, for poverty and all the rest. And it is because it's such a big problem. Yeah? Yet there are solutions if you, again, and that's why I think looking at the housing sector is so important. There are solutions in regular processes with slum dwellers that organizations like Slum Dwellers International, supported by various NGOs like Homeless International, Spark and others, undertake, where there are processes where people move from an illegal land situation and sort of informal housing to formal housing, which we can learn an enormous amount from when it comes to reconstruction, because the examples are there, and we can take those examples and use them in reconstruction. There have also been examples in some programs where governments have actually made an effort to make land available to people who had no titles before, or made land grants available to such people. So you can bring it into a reconstruction strategy. There are various examples of that. But it needs to be thought about from the beginning and not as something that, in near Colombo, after 3 years or so of reconstruction, there were still people living in tents or transitional houses who had been squatters or tenants before. And they just forgot until somebody pointed it out, and then finally people started to seek a solution for that.
Okay, brilliant. Cassidy, would you like to make a comment? There's one question that I don't think we've touched on, navigating local power elites, and the lady on the third row experience in Pakistan. I don't know if you want to take a stab at that one. Was that too tricky?
I'm happy to come back at that.
You're going to come back to that, so you don't have to.
I will.
You will. Okay.
Just to add on, I think that, as everyone has mentioned here, I think the issues for both scaling up, the issue of can scaling up happen without government leadership, and the issue of squatters and tenants, I think that the regulations and laws revolving around both of these are very much key to it. And I think the squatter and tenant situation, part of it is that the formal laws within the country revolving around reconstruction or around housing do include people who do not necessarily own land. And so that's one basis. The second is the land issue, which Joe has raised. And also that these things are very much based on what's already happening in the housing programs that are happening in the country. And so we can't divorce it from that. About the local power elites and power relations, I think that this is a very strong force in terms of determining, especially at the community level, who has access to things. Certainly in Turkey, the organizations that have better connections to the government was very, very clear that they received better land to rebuild on. It was very clear that their projects and programs were funded, whereas others weren't, that maybe have different political perspectives or different religious perspectives. So this is a very real situation. But also, I think to counter that, there was advocacy from outside organizations and funding from outside organizations that helped these groups that weren't supported necessarily by the government. So there's I think a good opportunity with international cooperation to stabilize some of those power issues.
Did you want to
Just
come in
very,
on this
very
one?
quickly, this is not really to contradict anything that's been said, but just to highlight a connection, I think. We've been talking about the importance of working in small clusters in order to achieve things long term. And I think that's also very important when you're thinking about negotiating with local power elites, because I think effectively, in principle, power elites are not interested in change. And most people don't really have the imagination to conceive of what change any given solution might bring to them. And so the more that you can negotiate in concrete terms about known facts, about known people, known buildings, known streets, known blocks, known lots, the more the element of irrational fear is removed from the discussion, and the more it's possible to achieve pragmatically solutions. I think it's very difficult in a country like Haiti, where 4 or 5 people can come forward with equal legal basis to claim a piece of land. But for most situations, it's not a bad approach. And perhaps for that situation, it's also the least horrendous, the least difficult.
Listen, we're coming to the end of the session. I suppose if someone asked me to say how we address the question about whether it's possible to scale up participatory and developmental reconstruction and shelter. I think on the basis of what I've heard from our 4 panellists today, I mean, I think the answer is probably not without a policy and planning framework. It's not possible to do that. Now, I'm not sure if that's actually the case, but that's what I've heard. And I just wonder if we could just, as the final thing here, ask each of the panellists just to say, give one thing that needs to happen in order for there to be a better chance for policy and planning frameworks to be put into place, because I've heard quite a few reasons why they're not there. There's not good leadership, the people that are dealing with it are coming to emergencies for the first time and so on. So is there one thing that you can say, one really key thing that needs to be put in place so that we have this policy and planning framework that will enable us to be able to scale up reconstruction and shelter in a participatory and developmental way? Who wants to go first?
I think I've already said something.
Go on, say it again.
Which is that the beneficiaries need to be represented on any sort of body that sets a framework for reconstruction that benefits them.
Great. Joe?
I think the key thing is leadership. I think that the success in Aceh at the end of the day was down to the gentleman who ended up running BRR, and he stayed and did that job for 5 years. And he set it his task. He said, I'm going to understand all of this, and all you people are going to help push me up a learning curve. And he is fascinating to talk to. He says the thing that he could never understand was the fact that the humanitarian community come in and they just want to do one thing. They just want to do houses, or they just want to do water, or they just want to do this. He said, it doesn't make sense to me. Why can't someone just assist a community with like things they need? And I think informed leadership, by finding those informed leaders, who are nationals from their own country, who really want to do the right thing for their people. And it is more challenging in some countries than others, and issues of corruption. And I think the second thing that goes with that is informed advisors for those leaders. The organisations who are responsible for advising the government actually are people who really do know what they're talking about, and are not actually just furthering the aims of the organisations they work for.
Great. So am I right, we have more beneficiary participation, better leadership and more informed advisors?
I'm going to give a much less idealistic answer on this count, because I'm basing my conclusion here on the experience of Sri Lanka. Really, the reason Sri Lanka adopted an owner-driven program as part of its housing reconstruction policy was pressure from the World Bank. It wouldn't really have gone ahead and done it otherwise. They did it to get the World Bank off their backs. It was a surprise to everybody that it took off so fast and so well and became overriding. So I think sometimes the donors need to take responsibility for what they're going to see. And the donors are sort of ambivalent about it, because on the one hand, they want to see results on the ground as fast as possible. It looks like this, doesn't really matter about how it was produced. And certainly the agencies feel that pressure from the donors. So I think it needs to start, he who pays the piper should call that tune.
So more clarity from donors.
In a particular direction.
Yeah.
That was part of my answer, was that certainly the donors have a big impact on the way that reconstruction is done and what they're asking for in what they're lending. So that's one thing, and that's certainly for the big donors of the development banks, basically. But also, I think there's something else that is outside the policy and planning frameworks of the local country necessarily, but has to do with the policies of the donor organizations, which is that they don't lend directly to small organizations. It's all going through the government. And there can be processes where donors can lend directly to organizations, smaller organizations that can do reconstruction on the ground. And this needs to be a change, not in policy and planning of the governments, but of the donors, to be able to do that kind of lending or that kind of giving.
Brilliant. Well, you heard it here first. We've got the action plan here for better policy and planning frameworks. Just to apologise to the people who didn't get a chance to speak, I'm sorry, we've run out of time, but I wonder if you could put your hands together and just give some applause to our four presenters.